Welcome back to the Berg Podcast. Thanks for joining us today. With me today is Ford.
Hey, how's it going?
And Dan.
Hey, everybody.
And today we're talking about changing of seasons and changing of jobs. Really, we've got a bunch of jobs that are closing out. It is that time of year, right? So seasonally, as things come to a conclusion and we transition into the next phase of work, it's interesting and it's fun, but it's a lot of hustle, right?
Yeah,
it's
a lot of juggling. It's a lot of juggling as we come in and out. We've been really intentional this year. Over the past couple of years, we've gotten better at it, but this year I feel like we've been really intentional about the job startup. So not just the closeout, right? That's a little tricky because you're trying to get out the door. You're trying to make sure you have the punch list done and everything else. And there's some hesitation by me, even because I feel like the guys are like, yeah, we have the punch list is completely done. And I'm just waiting for something to come back at me that I got to go fix, which really throws a monkey wrench in, but it's not happening right now, which is great. And on the flip side, we had enough of a cushion there with some of the guys that we were able to get them the prints and get them the plans. And so not just as the project managers know, but the actual foremen have had a chance to look at the job, know what they're walking into. And in some cases, they're even coming in fresh. We have one job that's going to start for sure, where the foreman's going to come right off of vacation. So he's going to come off of vacation because it's obviously we're getting into hunting season. And so he's going to come off of vacation and walk right into a new job. And so that's talk about a great way to start a job is you're starting fresh. You came out of a job, that we did well on. You had a chance to look at the prints for a few weeks, then you go on vacation, like clear your head, figure out what you're doing, spend time with your family, and then boom, come back into a new job. Knowing that, they're going to, the GCs, the owners are going to want what they're going to want. Now it's a race to winner, right? It's a race to how fast can you get the site opened and then get them something that they can work on over the winter. And we have that going on quite a few jobs. So,
let's talk about just for a second, like jobs closing, right? So I felt like we're coming out of a season, and this is just my perception. I'm not in the field, so maybe our field personnel or you guys disagreeing, but we're coming out of some jobs that in some ways were more technical than stuff that we've ever done, right? Just sort of thinking, as we wrap up the Longwood job, as we wrap up some of the things that we did with the folks on the horse farm.
So I don't think that's false. I think what happened is, we've had a steady flow of landfill work that we do and golf, which is a different. I don't want to say simpler because I don't mean that insulting, but the size of it makes it that it feels a little bit simpler, a little less complex, even though it may be actually just as complex because you have so much time. The durations are longer. You have time and everybody understands it. And we ended up on what amounts to a bunch of postage stamp sites, right? Like even Twin Ponds, which was a very big site. The actual work area was not that big. It was a little bit tight.
Right.
And we ended up on a bunch of postage stamp sites. And those really make you feel the technical nature of our work because you're doing everything right on top of themselves.
Right.
So whether it be, Wissahickon or Aronimink or Hershey or, any of those jobs, Twin Ponds, we feel that way. And now we are coming into a couple jobs. We got a really neat utility job starting that's going to go pretty quickly with Jack. And then we obviously have one of the biggest of our projects going with Camp Camino. So Camp Camino, the guys have heard about it for a long time. It was a long process for Dylan and I to work through the contract. But we've got to, it's almost like a design build, which is really neat for us. It's something that Ford has always wanted, right? We've always talked about jobs with people we know, doing things we know in places we know, and being able to get to an owner ahead of time and say, hey, we're looking at the prints and we think this might be, a better option where it would be a little bit less money for you and a little bit less work for us, but it makes more sense. And we've really gotten to do that on this project where we looked at it and said, we think this, this makes sense or this doesn't make sense. And so I'm excited to see that start from the perspective of it's something Ford and I have talked about for Ford, how long have we been talking about trying to get to the owners for the good of the job?
Well, yeah, you always hope for it. That's the thing, and you just don't get there very often. But I think the other thing is that as we're thinking back through this, there's a lot of land in our area, and you go other places, and it's not more abundant, but it's more raw ground. I was just somewhere else, and it was just raw ground everywhere. And I think that ebbs and flows with that technical part you're talking about. But the reality is we are in a more mature area, so there is a lot more of that.
Yeah.
Interagency cooperation because we're doing a little job here in town that literally is pretty basic. All of a sudden a utility got involved, turned into a 3-ring circus.
Just escalates everything.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
You know, had to get 10 more people involved, conference calls, owner, client, everybody had to get involved in something that was simple. Before we started, it was just straightforward pipe replacement. Like, okay, you know, they had a little problem. We were going to fix it. And it mushroomed on them and us, not because we wanted it to, but it just happened.
Right.
But I think that is just, as we continue to go forward, the new normal, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, I think that is like in the back of our mind that we have to really enjoy when we have projects that have a little elbow room on them or a little bit more simplicity, because I don't think that is what we're going forward to. I think, and the benefit is some of the people, what they've learned on some of these highly technical jobs, the next time they go into something like that, they're going to even be better prepared. And, oh yeah, I've seen this before. I've dealt with this before. I know I need to get ahead of this issue and start calling the right people now because I need to deal with this in 3 weeks versus opening the hole and being like, oh, now we have to deal with stuff. So I think we have a little, you know, reprieve, but I think it just ebbs and flows. I don't think there's like, oh, we, you know, one way or the other, you know, we've done a lot of jobs on postage stamps because it seems like postage stamps is between the governmental regulatory issues. They don't want to give you more space than you should have in their mind. And then you're moving a pile of dirt 3 times because you don't have space to do what you need to do on a job site. And I think that's just becoming what we're going to deal with. I don't think it's going to go away. Just, you know, it wasn't just like one cycle of them. I think we're just in general going to have that issue.
Well, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, and I think you're right. I think like in our area, the landfill does seem to be different because in many ways it's bulk earth movement, and we don't run into a lot of bulk earth movement projects in our other forms of work because of some of the things you're talking about, right? There aren't a lot of just acres and acres and acres waiting to be developed, right? There aren't a lot of big fresh sites that have never been touched. And part of the problem, and you're talking about the little project in town here, is maybe those things were done 20 years ago, maybe they were done 100 years ago. And you're lucky if somebody actually documented what was going to be there, right? And had the technology to tell you the place it was going to be. And now we're going in. I think one of the tricky parts about that project that you were just speaking about was the things that we thought were going to be there showed up in wrong places, and some things that weren't supposed to be there showed up there too.
Yeah. Well, I think landfills are, you know, in general, from the outside public world, their entire site is permitted. So they can just go say, hey, go put a pile over here or over there. But when we're working with a new permit project, they don't have that flexibility because they only permitted what they needed to permit just because of time, cost, all those factors. But you just don't have someplace that's a 500-acre permit where you're like, we're only working on 100 of it. We got 400 here. If we need to move something, we just move it one time and be out of the way. Yeah. I mean, even on the one landfill, I was up there the other day, and like where they're doing the one phase of the work, there's nothing around it because that's a future area, but it's all in their permit. So they can do that now, whereas most other places all right, you got to do something on top of something else.
Yeah. And so a couple things that I think of with that. One, I want to be clear for, you know, our own guys as well as people listening. It is not that there's not land within our reach. But the other thing is that we try and do what we know, right? So there's a number of contractors who are focusing on big 1 million square foot pads, right? They're chasing the big buildings, the big warehouses, the tilt-ups. So there is some dirt where you could go work in open fields or you know, if you go after the big track home developments and you can get in there early, but it's not what we do.
Sure.
So when we get into the sites that we would deem commercial industrial, they tend to be a little bit tighter or a little bit reuse. And one of the things that really has happened lately, and I like, you know, physically knock on wood, is the guys have done a really good job of finding the utilities without finding the utilities. You know, like I know there was another job, you know, the Hershey job. And same thing, we're digging in. There's not even supposed to be any pipes there, and then there's 2 pipes there, and it became very, very complex to try and figure out how to address this and how to deal with it. And we're definitely becoming more conscious of it and more aware, and our teams are able to work through it, be a little bit more proactive, and see the surprise coming a little bit, as Fort said, like whether it be in their digging or in their planning. You know, just looking at it and saying like, all right, hold on, wait a minute. This says it's going to be here, but is this where it would be? You know, so. All of that's really good signs as we continue to grow and as we continue to to advance is that we're getting better at those pieces and getting more used to that piece of our world. And it's funny because when you think about it, we've talked about our history and the 20-year thing. That's part of the progression, right? Is now becoming sort of comfortable and mature in understanding how to work in these specific sites and these conditions, and then going forward with more expertise and more experience and facing that, whether that be from the office side or the field side. I think we're better positioned to do that now. And it's exciting as we go out and start, the next batch of jobs. And so we continue to have the exact issue we want, which is one more shoe drops in terms of one more contract, and we probably have a little bit more work than we want right now. But that's where we want to operate, honestly, because that allows us to be efficient and quick with moving from job to job and balancing, and good with utilization of our equipment, right? Because that's something if there's one thing that we really need to focus on as a team over the next year, it's getting the utilization rates back to where they used to be, pre-COVID, or when we were running our equipment that way. Because that's, we don't talk about it often with the field, but that's one of the things. When we build an estimate, even if we built it right, our rates are based on the fact that our equipment runs a certain amount of hours. Right. If the equipment runs less per hour per month, then the cost goes down only in the sense of the fuel, but not in the sense of the equipment. So that's one of the things, that we have to be mindful of when we're bidding. So anytime when, guys in the field feel like, I wonder why Dylan and Scott and Dan are still bidding all this stuff, we're still bidding it because we need to be able to keep the hours at a rate where not only do the guys get their hours every month so that they can pay their bills, but the equipment runs every month. So it's a tricky balance as you start that. But I feel good about where our numbers are. We've been very competitive lately. And there's a lot of good work out there. So Dylan and I have seen, an uptick again with the bidding. Scott's seeing it to some degree, but special projects is seasonal in terms of the bidding. So we know when the houses are going to come out. Right. I mean, come January, there's floodgates going to open, and Scott's going to get bombarded with bids from the guys that we like to do work for. So he has the work to get them there, and then he's just got to wait for January. Until then, it'll be hit or miss what comes through for special projects. So
yeah,
it's an interesting dynamic with. We always talk about the seasonality of our business, but there's even micro seasons within those seasons, right? Yeah. It's like. Mm-hmm. They always say that houses sell in the spring and the fall. They don't sell in the summer. Well, someone build a new house is kind of the same thing because, their builders are telling them if you try and build over the wintertime, this is going to happen. This costs are going to go up. So if they can wait, they're going to wait till their spring release, and then they're going to try and knock them out in the summer and hopefully be in by the next school year. That's kind of their target range. But, I think they've been also seeing a lot of other unique projects, not just residential, just small, sinkholes that we've talked about before.
Well, and
they've done some baseball fields, just stuff that's keeping the variety of life in there.
A lot of community-oriented things, right? Yes. I mean, housing is definitely community-oriented, but things that are maybe more visible or more public sometimes than working on a private custom residence or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and we were able to help out. Petersheim got called last weekend. I think it was last weekend. For all of a sudden there was a couple issues. I think a well and a water main break,
right?
And I was in Virginia, and Colt called me, and we talked about it, and we were able to jump out there and get on that. So that was good. The other thing Ford was mentioning sinkholes that I think is really funny. So we have this map in the office, and most of the guys know it. It's in the conference room, and it just has pins in it everywhere that we've worked. If we work multiple jobs at a place, we don't put multiple pins or just one pin. But it is funny. There is now pink is sinkholes. And there's just
quite the fault line.
It is a fault line. It is the craziest thing to see on that map. They're just all right in a row. Yeah. It's literally it's a fault line.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing, the sinkholes is the existence of that rock in that area. So it's really there's different things you can see on the map. Yeah. When you look at it, you see, landfills, you see far, right? So the landfills, all of a sudden they're way out. They're outliers, that they're much further than we would normally go. Commercial tends to be in a circle, concentric circle around us. Residential tends to be east of us. But the fault line is so clear with that pink just sitting there in the middle of it.
You think you're turning into a little bit of a seismic predictor here?
Don't buy a house there.
Yeah, you do know it.
So
you do know it. You start to feel it. The guys are really good at that. It is funny to see. Even if they were digging an anchor trench up at the landfill, and they were hitting rock. So they were hammering and coming through. And one of the guys was like, we're going to hit rock up this whole hill. And I was like, I don't know. That looks like a pinnacle. And I was like, I felt like who am I? Where did that come from? Like a pinnacle. I mean, it did end up being a pinnacle, but like nothing, I don't know what about it made me think that, because the ground didn't look like it formerly did, right? We blasted that site. So,
sure.
But it was just something about the way that the contour made me think, like, I don't know. I don't think rock would have been there all the way up the hill. And I'm sure they hit more up, but I thought it was the results of the blast, not of actually the.
Interesting.
So, but it is interesting to see it with the guys doing that. So, I mean, it's been interesting. This is one of my favorite times of year is when we turn these jobs over and start again. And, you get to get a feel for going and it makes it a race, right? Here, we all love competition. Here comes competition. It's going to be December in 60 days. You know what I mean? You got 40 work days to turn over a new job, get started and get to something that they can use. And sometimes we hit it, sometimes we don't, sometimes weather doesn't cooperate and you end up with weather that you can't work in, but it is going to be fun. It's a good set of jobs. I think the guys are going to be excited to get on them and get to move. We'll see what we do with equipment wise. We've gone back and forth with, is it big enough that we run pans, or are we going with our trucks like we always do, that sort of thing. So it's fun to see our equipment run again.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've told this story so many times, I'm probably going to hear, but it's always so funny when you see like a couple pieces in the yard and you want to see the least amount you can in the yard, right? It's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
Like, you're like, remember being a kid and going past the competitor and like looking at him and like, I want to see equipment, and never saw it there. I'm so disappointed. Now I realize like, that's what you want to see. Like, if you see half of their fleet in the yard, that's
not a good sign, right?
That's not the best sign on earth.
Yeah. And well, even like I remember it's going back a couple of years, but you and I were taking a drive through the South on our way between meetings, and you knew we were going to be passing a manufacturer, right? And we're kind of like, oh, let's take a turn here. Let's go past their yard, and like it's always a little bit of a telltale sign. Like they have a bunch of stuff sitting there that's not selling, or they have very few things, and that explains why it's been hard to get stuff or whatever. So, yeah, if the yard's full,
good old Chattanooga.
Yeah, probably not a great sign for
and we're still
timing wise.
There's a lot of availability of equipment right now, which is good because then you need equipment, you can go get it. But it also is indicative of some nervousness in the market and some hesitation as we go through the end of the year here. But it's funny. Jim had actually said to me, he was like, "Hey, do you want to move this dozer somewhere so it's not sitting here?" And I was like, "No, it's good. It's got a place to go. We just need to get it there. I'm not going to like preemptively move it." But he feels that pressure that like, hey, there's a couple dozers sitting in the yard. And I'm like, that happens. We closed out the job. We did a great job. We met the deadline. Yeah. You can't, it's hard to line it up that I can pull it from one right to the
straight
other.
to the other.
That usually means I'm already in trouble. You know what I mean? It means that somebody's already mad that we're behind if I'm moving that quickly. But we're close. I mean, it's.
Do you find it funny when you were talking earlier about how many people, maybe financial sector or whatever, are trying to like pump you for information about like what you're seeing, because they're trying to do like canary in the coal mine scenarios, and they're trying to like, so what are you seeing out there? And they're like trying to go through this whole dance and like trying to ask you like the same question from 14 different sides, and the answer is the same, doesn't matter which side, but they always are asking you like, well, what's your bidding like, or what's this like, or what's this like, and you're just like, okay. I mean, like, it's funny because you're like, you never thought you'd be in a position where someone's like trying to use you as a canary to be like, is it dropping off? Did you not have any work left? It's like, no, we're busy. You know what? Just like trying, like, all of a sudden, whenever you have those conversations with people, whatever they are, that seems to be where they're always going to try and like get some kind of like insider info. And it's like,
Yeah. And well, I do see that. But I also, the funny part is Ford would have always said nothing. But I find the more we get into this, the more I say nothing about it, because it's just like, yeah, we're good. We got, because what's the answer going to be? Like, I understand what you're asking me. Like, this isn't Bloomberg News. I don't have some like secret telltale sign. You could see the same thing I could see. You know what I mean? Drive to the yards. Is there equipment sitting there? You know what I mean?
Right.
You can see it. Look at, it's pretty easy to see it. But everybody's like looking for the answer. But the irony is there isn't really an answer.
Well, and I think the big thing is that they're trying to tie a macro thing with a micro thing. Right? They're like, oh, the interest rate went down by half a point, or they call it whatever, right? And it's like, yeah, but each, like, that is the one unique thing with construction, is that it is so location based that what we're feeling or experiencing might be not something that someone 100 miles, 50 miles away is experiencing. Each area really has its own flow of how things are happening. I mean, except for back in 07, 08, nothing has really been that centralized across the board. So like, oh, you see like change. I'm like, listen, this area, it has its own flow. It has its own speed. It's more mature. It's not ebbing and flowing like maybe an up and coming market
like a Columbus.
Right.
Like Columbus is really interesting with all the tech building that's going on out there between everybody. I mean, everybody is there. Like if you go to Columbus, just east of Columbus, it is crazy. But so that drives everything. Like you don't have to be an economist to understand if you like, you have to build everything else, you know, and you see when we were in Virginia, it is Reston's that way. So west of DC, they built whole towns, and you're like, you sort of think like, what could support this? And then you drive a quarter mile further and it's just Google, Blue Origin, Amazon, Meta, just one after another. And then you drive a little further and there's just miles of these huge buildings with tons of air conditioning capacity and power. It's and transfer stations, substations. It's all servers. It's all cloud. You know, so like the one begets the other, right? Like in other words, it's funny because it used to be that it was industry, that it was, you know, you would see physically a factory like making cars or widgets, who cares?
Sure.
But they were making something. Right. And then, you know, Coatesville, right?
Yeah.
Like you had the Coatesville steel plant, then you build the town around Coatesville.
Right. You had to have the people
you had to have the people for the steel plant.
Yeah.
And then once you had the people for the steel plant, you needed the restaurants. Then once you needed the restaurants and the people worked at the steel plant, they had a little bit more money. Now you needed more land. You know what I mean? So, and it worked its way out. And it's a second coming of that, but just a different thing because it's the odd part is it's all built around servers basically.
Yeah. Interesting.
You know, and then and the servers, that building by itself is a whole, that you could take a couple podcasts talking about. Those buildings are almost a city by themselves because between the electric and the water and the cooling, you know, between the cooling and the water that they need.
I saw two funny things about that. So I saw an article because I was asking my friend down in Virginia, Fredericksburg, about it, and one of the power companies said like, we have no more power to give you like for 5 more years. Like you can't build anything, and they're building stuff because they need to be close to things. And then I saw another article yesterday that literally those big companies are building their own power generation at this point because they can't wait for.
Yeah. And well, and Ford and I have talked, I think Brian and I have talked about it as well. I have a friend who was in the Navy, is a nuclear engineer, was a nuclear sub captain, whatever. And now he's in private industry in the power industry in nuclear. And he was talking about, I think it was last year. I don't think it was 2 years ago, but they've come up with these like almost portable nuclear generators that like they're small. I put that in like air quotes because I don't know exactly what small is, but I'm told it can be moved. Like on a
you won't see the big things glowing in like they do at 3 Mile Island or
the
down
big cooling towers.
Yeah, I don't think it's that size.
But the idea is you start it up and then you have power, and I think that is the exact usage they're trying to get to. Is you can build that, you can build it there because you can generate your own power once you start it, and then until the actual electric company can come in, until the actual utility company can deliver you power, you can run off your own private generator. I think that is the idea of what they're trying to do.
The one I saw, which whatever, it's a prototype. It's like built on a barge because then they already have the water source that they need for the cooling there. Like,
they're just pulling it right off.
Floated up and down the river.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
That was what the prototype was. Now, whether it would ever be built, but that was literally what they're showing is just like a barge because there's your water source. You don't have to worry about it.
I don't know if it's the answer, but man, there's some smart people trying to figure it out because power is going to be an issue here.
Yeah. And I saw something recently. They're reopening the nuclear power plant that was
at 3 Mile.
Yeah. Right. So at least that's the plan. So,
yeah. Well, because I didn't realize that, but a lot of these ones that have been shut down are actually running now as like, because they have the access to stuff that they're actually being run is for computer based, either for
they have the
server
security,
farms, the Bitcoin,
they already have,
all that kind of stuff. Because I remember when we were out in Nevada, and then we went to Hoover Dam.
Yeah.
And as we drove to Hoover Dam and drove away from there was so much solar around there. I'm like, why is it out here? But then I realized they could tap into all the transmission lines that were existing and the ground was more accessible. So they didn't have to be close to anything. They just had to be able to tap into a main.
Yeah, it is a funny thing, right? Like we've gotten to an interesting point here, where we started conversation wise, but that is an interesting point that it's so access driven. You know what I mean? It's so, and that's where there's a little bit of a tie to our area with how the work goes, and you just keep building, keep building on top of building. It's because of access. It's because this is where the roads are. This is where the people are. what's the stat on the population? Remember before Al Roman had said it, something about like,
within 5 hours, you could, at whatever point that data was out, within 5 hours, you could reach, or within a day, you could reach 80% of the population or something.
It was some crazy stat from like Hazleton.
Yeah.
Right. Basically that, because you think about that, you're north of us, but you can get to Philly, Baltimore, New York, Boston. You can get to the New York towns. You can get to Chicago. You think about it, that within a day, that you've just covered a big, and DC.
Sure.
So you've covered, you have all the major cities on the East Coast plus Chicago. Population wise, the only thing you don't have is the West Coast, which you have to go a long way to get to.
Or the very southern,
the very southern, as they've exploded. And this was an older stat. It's probably changed as the migration moved a little bit further south.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's interesting.
But it is what drives this area and the nature of our business here, that they just keep building and finding space.
Yeah.
We're reusing it.
Something I was thinking about a couple minutes ago. Ford, you were talking about like kind of getting probed, or people trying to use you as a meter for economic forecasts, right?
That's what he thought he was going to be when he was younger. He's like, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to tell people what the economy is going to do.
Yeah.
When he was splitting wood, that's what he thought.
Yeah.
We get those questions a lot, and a lot of times it's like driven by the availability of money, right? Mm-hmm. So like when rates change and stuff like that, like, oh, have you seen the impact of that? And I always find that question a little funny. Maybe it's just like my perspective, but because the timing of construction isn't so like turnkey on and off, right? Like the availability of money usually impacts future projects, because now you might be able to finance something, or an owner might be able to finance something that they weren't planning on financing before, or things of that nature. Do you sort of agree with that? Like the Fed changing rates impacts a lot of things. A lot of times I don't think it impacts things like construction instantaneously. I think there's just some lag time until we see the effect of that type.
Well, I think that's why I laugh so much about when they ask those questions, because they think that there's such a direct correlation that there's not. I still remember back, I think it was 08, 09, and the government put out all this construction work, supposedly.
Right.
And everyone's like, oh, you're getting a piece of that? And it's like, no, they're repaving 95. That's not like, you know what I mean? Like, but to someone on the outside that just watches the news, that was like they were just giving work to all the construction companies, and that's not what it really was. And so I think that's part of it too, is like, oh, the rate dropped by 0.5%. It's going to magically do stuff. Our jobs are, before we even touch them, are probably 36 months in the planning. So like we would see much better chance of it going the other way, where somebody would just not do a project probably if something went extraneously in a different direction. Then we would see, oh, there's a little tick. It's going to all of a sudden fire a bunch. I mean, the only thing we could see is if something was already planned and they had held it.
They held it,
and then they wanted to fire it up. But I don't think no owner, no person that has a business or whatever that needs built something is going to be like, woke up this morning, the Fed dropped it 0.5%. Let's fire up the project.
Let's go, turn it back on.
Yeah. I mean, it's not how it
works.
But that's just, people have that immediate connection to the two factors that don't really have a correlation.
What's interesting is before they dropped rates for the first time, right? Interest rates were high, not historically. I mean, they were high, but not like outrageously, not 1978 high.
Right.
And we started to see, for whatever reason, that the construction slowed. And when it slowed, equipment started to funnel back into into the actual manufacturer's lots, and eventually the rentals were sitting there. And all of a sudden, I called Ford, and we started seeing 0% interest again. So that's the other thing, is it's driven by need, not by the Fed. Like, yes, the Fed has some impact on, but if you're a manufacturer of something and you're not selling the thing, you need to figure out a way to sell it. And sometimes that's you cut your rates. And then on the flip side of that, we don't make the decisions that way. Like, in other words, we had an RPO that I would have always tried to convince you and Ford to go after, right? Because we had some money in, and that's always my attitude. It's not the best attitude at times. The math doesn't work. But in this one, and I was like, well, it's 0%. And Ford was like, yeah, but this doesn't make any sense right now. Like it had zero bearing. Like I said, you know what I mean? In other words, think about the nature of that when you try and tie the Fed's rates to either the actual work coming or the purchase or sale of equipment. Is I say to Ford, like, hey, it's 0%. He's like, yeah, but we're not buying it right now. Whereas if we needed that machine, I'd come to you and say like, Brian, it's 7%, but we don't have a choice. I have to have that machine. Like I wouldn't like it. Sure, I'd love to have it for 0%. You know what I mean? But in other words, but most times these purchases occur out of either planning, to Ford's point, or need. You know what I mean? Like if you want one of the big Tracos, you might wait a year, 18 months to get it. You have no idea what the interest rate's going to be, and nobody's guaranteeing anything, but you need that machine.
Yeah.
So it's going to be what it's going to be when it gets there. And you hope that relationship wise and everything else that you can have a reasonable rate. But
that's true. Scale probably impacts it a lot. I hadn't thought about that, but like I'm sure some of these incredibly large like mining machines, right? That's not something that just shows up at your doorstep.
No.
So
you're ordering those 36, 48 months ahead of time.
Well, I don't remember, and we don't have to call it out, but I remember Ford and I had heard about one of the big guys around us, and they had ordered 5 or 6 of really big machines. And they were like, they had purchased them, and they were like, well, we should see them in 2 years. And it was like, just the planning. I mean, that's why I laugh when people think like that they're just a bunch of construction guys. Like these guys, I don't know many people that have to plan that far out. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to have a job that doesn't exist, that I'm going to need this equipment. In lieu of the equipment I have, like just they're 5 steps out, thinking ahead and spending the money with no concept of what the rates are because it doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
Having said that, manufacturers, we all love 0% interest. So.
Well, actually, I had a conversation with someone the other day, and I think jobs or clients that are on a bubble, like on the edge, it matters. But I don't think we've ever made a decision based on an interest rate, right? It doesn't.
Sure. Yeah.
You know.
Again, microcosm. Do you want to do it for 5 years or 7 years or 3 years? If they give you a better interest rate, you might move it. But it's not about the purchase. It's about
right. It's just so funny because everyone thinks that it so ties in, and it doesn't. Because if you have a piece and you can use it to its full extent, it will pay. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not saying that they put 30%, whatever. There's always a breaking point. But I'm saying that if up 2%, down 2% isn't really what makes or breaks something happen. If someone's building a new warehouse and whatever they're selling and building out of that warehouse, the interest rate on their loan isn't what's going to make or break them. It's if they can produce and sell enough of whatever product that square footage provides them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we've been all over the place. We've covered a bunch here. We started with switching jobs, but
we became economists by the end.
And became economists by the end. So, I mean, but it's what goes through all of our heads.
Forecaster.
But it's what goes through everybody's head as you try and figure this out and load up on the right work and try and time it with a bunch of different things that you can't control, much like the interest rates, to make it that you roll out of one job and you roll right into the other. And when we do it, it works out. And I feel like we're pretty close to doing it right now, where we're coming out of jobs and going right into other ones. So. Well, I'm excited as we get into that fall.
Not to completely jump it off target, but it also the same thing with politics, right? Like people are like, oh, is this going to do a thing? And you realize that like politics matter at certain levels, but they don't matter. It's the same operation.
It's the same operation.
I don't really care. It's not going to change. If someone needs to do something, they're going to do it one way or another. So
it'll be nice when they pull all the signs out.
Or when you're trying to watch anything, that's a whole other conversation.
That's a different podcast. We can talk about that on the first podcast in November.
Banning the ads.
We'll be so close.
I put on all my Phillies gear and cry every night while I watch the playoffs. But watching anything right now is brutal.
Oh. Yeah. And the ads are so bad because with the little kids, like they put some really crappy like violence. Like they're just trying to scare you so bad that you can't even like just. I literally had some kid something on in the ads because they don't control the ads well enough, and like it was like popped up with like violent gang members. I'm like, they're watching like a kid show. Like have some tact here, but we've gotten changed.
We don't have tact anymore. What we do have is by November 4th at least somebody will be in charge of something, and then we can move on.
Yeah. Stop ads for another 2.2 years.
Please stop ads for another maybe 6 months, and then we got to start it again.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, before we get deeper into that topic, we're definitely going to wrap it up. So thanks for joining us today, folks. We hope you got something for this, and we hope you come back for another episode.